While I can continue to churn out video after video talking about like different secret systems that you can incorporate into your build to handle essence management better, I continue to get a lot of questions about how do you make your essence near infinite, most notably on a Bone Spear Necromancer. And I want to point out why this is exceptionally important on this build, because while the Bone build has typically and historically been incredibly powerful because of the very simplistic nature to its engine, the funny part about it is that it's the only skill that gets weaker and weaker the more that you use it. The most notable culprit for this is the fact that Ossified Essence, our key passive, says that you're going to deal bonus damage based off of how much of your total essence you have when you cast a skill. Right now I'm gaining a 40% damage multiplier, which is a pretty massive multiplier considering my character is also wearing no gear other than a wand, and you can actually stack your essence up to pretty ridiculous amounts, like upwards of 300 or more. So the total benefit that you can get out of this thing is actually in the realm of 125% total damage multiplier, but that's only if you're ever casting your skill at maximum essence. But we can actually look at this bonus in real time, because every single time that I use Bone Spear, I'm going to end up spending more and more essence. And if I were to go back into my skill tree and actually show you, you'll notice that our total bonus is actually very low at 0, because we're currently under a total of 50 essence, which you need to hit at least that minimum to even get a damage boost out of this. Now, we're also regenerating at a ridiculously slow rate, but as our total goes up, you'll notice that our bonus continues to increase a little bit and a little bit more over time. But what this basically means is for you to get any benefit out of Ossified Essence alone, you need to somehow fix this constant issue, this near paradox of using essence reduces my damage, but using essence is the only way that I can do damage. When you then add on additional specific aspects like Serration, which says that your Ossified Essence also increases your critical strike damage of bone skills for 1% for every essence above 40, maxing out at a total of 90 because you can't get greater than a 40% bonus here. What this means is that you need to keep your essence at a minimum of 90 to get the total multiplier out of Serration. And then on top of that, the Serration passive skill, something that I think is one of the most confusing things because nobody knows what you're talking about when you say Serration, also requires you to have essence on cast to be able to get the total bonus out of your critical strike chance. And the less that you crit with bone skills, the thing that ultimately is its only real multiplier, the more that you miss out on damage. But what this basically means is that, unlike any other core skill, which, yes, once you run out of essence, you can't keep casting it, theoretically reducing your damage output, but it doesn't negatively impact you for not having permanent essence up the entire time. That means that we need to find a way to keep our essence up without needing to worry or wait or lose time generating essence manually. Now, there are a ton of phenomenal generators in this game, with the Bone generator actually being foremost amongst them, because while it generates a smaller amount of total essence than something like Hemorrhage, it generates it per target hit by one of your Bone splinters, with each splinter being able to hit a target simultaneously because it can shotgun, generating 21 essence. Now, if you were to put on a ton of essence generation, like if you were to have 33% essence generation here, you would actually generate 28 essence every single time that you cast Bone splinters, which is actually incredibly powerful. A lot of people in the endgame really shy away from ever using a generator, but I do think that Bone Splinters is uniquely efficient on the Bone Spear Necromancer, since it continues to trigger things like Compound Fracture, because every single time that you cast Bone Splinters, they can each crit, so you can maintain your bonuses there. It also maintains your Bone Graft bonuses, which say that you have to hit a target with bone skills. But I think a lot of people generally hate using a generator because it feels slow and sluggish, and while I tend to understand that concept, bare minimum, if you're having essence issues, just use Bone Splinters. It's fantastic. You only really need to cast it like 2 or 3 times before you can cast your next Bone Spear. But then we start looking for faster ways of being able to generate essence than what you would typically use from a generator. This is where we run into things where using Shattered Spirit with your Bone Spirit is able to generate a ton of essence. That's fantastic. It's not nearly as good in the end game, since a lot of the bonus that you get is actually from the Bone Splinters themselves, and that's not a percentage bonus, but it continues to be a really good tool. And I already have a video covering that, so I'm not going to bore you to details, but it kind of falls into the same trap that using a generator does in the mindset of a lot of different players, which is that it's interrupting my damage output. This isn't good enough. To them, I would say, It's literally a half second, but I hear you, I've got something else. This is where exposed flesh comes into play. If you've played a Bone Spear Necromancer before, you already understand how this is required on the build, but it is a phenomenal tool because it is a lucky hit chance skill that says whenever you were to hit a vulnerable target, you can generate up to 50 essence. And this can trigger off Bone Spears, it can trigger off of the Bone Shards from Bone Spears, this can trigger off Bone Spirit, it can trigger off Bone Splinters, it can trigger off Bone Storm. If you trigger Bone Storm with a lidless wall on, it can trigger off the Bone Storm that's triggered by your lidless wall. And this is where the real meat and potatoes of how the build ultimately functions is built off of this engine right here. Now, the issue that you're going to run into walking into Season 3, which is something that has also been covered previously, but basically back in the day, Bone Spear had two options. You could make the first target that you hit vulnerable, or you can get additional crit chance and also summon 2 additional shards. And remember, I said that the shards can trigger exposed flesh, so being able to generate 2 more shards helps a long way to be able to continue to generate essence from exposed flesh. The issue being that exposed flesh reads that the monster must be vulnerable. And now the splintering aspect, which applies vulnerable to everything except for the first monster which is hit, means that if you are using the best damage bonus, best crit chance, and the best essence generation tool, you actually can't generate essence off the first target hit because you won't apply vulnerable to that target. Whereas I will apply vulnerable to the targets behind it. And while that doesn't seem like that big of an issue in density, you run into problems against big single targets like bosses, where you all of a sudden aren't generating essence at the rate that you used to be able to with exposed flesh because you're not applying vulnerable. So it almost makes it look like supernatural Bone Spear is required for this build to function, and you're not wrong, except that we have other ways of being able to apply vulnerable, and this is something I've been talking about in previous videos, but the long and short of it is, this is the reason why I'm currently using Corpse Tendrils to be able to apply vulnerable, Bone Prison to be able to apply vulnerable, and in addition to that, I'm actually using my Seneschal Companion to be able to apply vulnerable as well. Now, luckily for you, if you use Tempest along with Arcing, you actually get your breaking support up to 100% activation chance. It does mean that you can maintain vulnerable even against a single target or multiple targets 100% of the time without any other overlapping systems. And in addition to Bone Splinters being able to push your vulnerability deep into pockets of monsters, you'll actually be fine. But most people aren't at the point where they have Tempest with Arcing and breaking up to tier 10 yet, so you need something else to be able to get there. So that's why you'll see me, while I'm speed farming, continuing to use Supernatural, since you can't really rely on Bone Prison and Grasping Veins when doing Hell Tides and stuff like that, because you're just mowing down monsters continuously. But once I am in a dungeon, I'm relying on those systems as well as my Seneschal, so I can actually go back to using Paranormal. But looking at a Necromancer that's just using Splintering along with Exposed Flesh, and then in addition to that, Supernatural Bone Spear, we can typically maintain near permanent uptime on essence generation against a multitude of enemies. And I'll just kind of shoot here and talk through it until I run out of essence. But you'll notice that we're like able to generate essence at a pretty decent clip. Sometimes we're going to run out here because I'm literally naked except for this gear. But that's the base conceit of the entirety of the engine. Hit a vulnerable target, get lucky and proc lucky hit, generate a huge amount of essence out of exposed flesh, and basically pray that you go infinite. But basically against a single target, this system cannot go infinite by itself. There is a universe where you could get incredibly lucky, because it turns out that Bone Spear actually has a really good lucky hit chance, but a 57% chance of triggering this, based off of a 10% chance of this happening, means that we expect to generate essence 5.7% of the time. And even if you manage to hit a target with all 3 splinters in the initial Bone Spear, you aren't going to go infinite off of this percentage unless you are the luckiest gambler in the universe. So now we need to start thinking about the actual stats that can help us to accomplish this. 1, maximum essence. Maximum essence is probably the most important stat for being able to minimize the issues with this system and be able to maximize the returns on it. Because not only does increasing your maximum essence literally increase the amount of time that you are continuing to net very large bonuses from ossified essence, serration, and then serration in the skill tree, but it also means that once you're sitting around like halfway through your essence, every single time that something like exposed flesh actually triggers, you're able to regain a total benefit from it. What do I mean by that more specifically? Well, let's think about an example where I literally just cast a single Bone Spirit, right? So I cast Bone Spirit one time, I'm now at minus 27 essence. And what that means is that even if I were to trigger exposed flesh here, I would only get half of the benefit out of it, right? Because I can't generate more essence than I have. So Having the largest total globe of essence not only means that you are just able to get the maximum benefit out of exposed flesh, but it also means that you're able to hit effectively like a minimum amount of essence where you're still capable in outputting damage. Considering the fact that a character starts off with 100 essence, the moment that you're at 200 essence, anything that you were to cast that spends essence down to 100 is still more powerful than even a starting character who hasn't invested in essence at all. So being able to invest in essence not only gets you a bigger damage bonus out of the end, but means that your minimum amount of damage is higher than it could be without it, and then also helps it so that you are increasing how much total essence you can kind of carry around with you so that none of your systems are ever overhealing your essence inefficiently. Okay, great. Everybody knows that you need maximum essence. Let's talk about the other stats though, because it's something that isn't immediately apparent or is hard to kind of quantify, but it is resource generation, percentage increase in resource gen. Resource generation says any source which grants you essence is going to be more efficient than it was previously. While we have natural essence regeneration, that's not what essence generation is. This is just how much you generate per second, and it's based off of the base value, which is 3, along with your willpower. And then if you very specifically are using the aspect of torment, which only works for essence regeneration and doesn't work for anything that generates essence on demand, like Bone Prison, Bone Spirit, or using a basic skill generator. But because of this, the more of it that you stack, the more efficient your base essence regeneration is, the more efficient your essence generation from things like Bone Prison become, and then on top of that, the more efficient the exposed flesh proc becomes. If I have 33% essence generation and I proc exposed flesh, I'm getting an additional 33% of 50, which is just under 17. So I go from generating 50 essence to basically 67 essence with a perfect roll at 33%. So you can see how that's already like a pretty massive inclusion, right? If exposed flesh is our primary engine, making our primary engine like 30 or 40 or even 50% more efficient is definitely an amazing way to be able to churn out as much essence gen as possible. So already with just throwing on another ring that gives me more maximum essence and more resource generation, even against a single target, I should be able to maintain a higher output of essence generation, and every single time exposed flesh is proccing, it's better. But you notice I'm still not infinite. And why am I still not infinite? Well, we do need to trigger lucky hit chance, and it turns out that's just really hard. Like I said, the 10% lucky hit chance bonus here, even with a high base lucky hit chance on Bone Spear, means that the base skill, when I take off my wand, only has a 50% lucky hit chance. So I'm only triggering it 5% of the time. That's why you notice that a lot of people opt for a wand, since a wand comes along with a huge amount of lucky hit chance to start, and then you can go even further to put lucky hit chance on your helmet when you have barrier, on your amulet when you have barrier, as well as on both of your rings. Now, I don't currently have it because I don't currently need it, but that is one of the ways to help to increase the efficiency of this system. Right? Even if I were to get my 5% chance up to a 6% chance to trigger, that means that you have increased the total amount of times that you will trigger this ability by 20%. And that's going to be felt in the long run as you continue to play through the game. So if one proc ability that says generate essence on lucky hit is good, what about more systems like that? Lidless Wall has lucky hit chance up to a 5% chance to restore primary essence. Now this works completely independently of exposed flesh. This doesn't require you to be hitting a vulnerable target, and it doesn't only trigger off of your Bone Spear. This will trigger off of your corpse tendrils when it hits a target. It has a small opportunity to be able to trigger off of Blood Mist when that hits a target. The ability to trigger this with overlapping damage systems makes Bone Storm summoned from Lidless Wall even more efficient, and you can put this both on your shield as well as on your gloves. They are the same effect, so rather than both of them triggering independently, you now have a 5% chance to trigger a total of 15.8 plus 10.5. If they were both perfect rolls, it would be 21%. But when this triggers, you will generate the total bonus that you get across all of your pieces of gear that have that same lucky hit bonus. So now I have a 5% chance to trigger it here and a 10% chance to trigger it here. That's still not enough, but it helps. Now the added benefit here from Lidless Wall is that it also has maximum essence. Again, increasing our total globe, increasing our total minimum effective bonus, and then also increasing how much essence we can carry around with us to start. So that's a double whammy right there. We're getting the increased chance of it happening, and we're getting the additional essence to top off with. Now there are obviously a ton of skills which will also generate essence on demand, and this is typically why you'll see Bone Spear Necromancers using something like the Sacrilegious Ring. Sacrilegious Ring will trigger Corpse Explosion and Corpse Tendrils once every 1 second if you have the minimum roll on it, and then once every 8 seconds for Corpse Tendrils itself. And not only can you generate essence from Grim Harvest, this, which says every single time that you consume a corpse, you generate 6 essence, which with our bonus to essence generation would actually be 8 essence. But the ticking from the corpse explosion itself can then go on and hit a vulnerable target, thus triggering exposed flesh. Because again, it doesn't need to be a bone skill, it can be any skill that successfully hits the target while it's vulnerable. So not only does generating corpses then feed into this system where exposed flesh will automatically consume them to generate essence, but even the ticking from the blighted corpse explosion is able to trigger exposed flesh as well. You'll notice I haven't really looked down in a little bit, but I'm pretty sure we're now basically infinite. I just put on my gear and I added on this ring, and then I ran out as I was explaining that because fate is a cruel, cruel mistress. But these are different ways that people are able to further supplement and automate their essence generation on the character itself. So we can generate essence from our skills, we can generate essence from lucky hit, we have multiple lucky hit types that can generate essence, and then being able to increase the chances of those lucky hit abilities from proccing are some of the best avenues to be able to further increase the efficiency of the build that we have as it stands right now. But we haven't talked about a very specific stat, which is actually infinitely more important than any of these other ones, and that is reducing essence cost in the first place. Essence cost reduction is by far and large the most important stat for the entirety of this system, because not only does it mean that literally your skill costs less essence to cast, but it also means that you're reducing your total essence by less every single time that you cast a skill, meaning that the next time that you cast a skill, if you didn't succeed at generating essence in between, you are minimizing how much damage you're losing. So with all my essence cost reduction gear on right now, my Bone Spear costs 20 essence. Whereas without all of my essence cost reduction gear on, Bone Spear is going to cost 27 essence. And if that is a different number than what you have currently, just remember that Imperfectly Balanced increases the cost of your spender skills. But by adding on essence cost reduction on your boots, which can max roll up to 10.3, as well as having essence cost reduction a maximum of 23.7 on your amulet, means that you can get up to a whopping total of 34% essence cost reduction. But now with all of our additional maximum essence, all of our resource generation on procs, all of our different lucky hit abilities, as well as our essence cost reduction, we theoretically should be able to go infinite even against a single target. So I'm going to sit here and spam Bone Spear, and hopefully it does an impressive enough showing to better exemplify just how powerful all these different systems are together when you use them. And you know, sometimes we're dipping pretty low, but we're never quite running out here. Now, there are an amazing amount of powerful items that would further increase the efficiency of this build. Most notably, Starless Skies, which is just like insanely powerful. It's just the best item in the game now. But that item, after using essence 4 times, will actually reduce your essence cost by an additional 40%. And that's why Starless Skies is wildly, wildly powerful, because it also gives you a 40% damage bonus. So basically every single build is going to be recommending that in the end game. So I'm sorry in advance. But as you can see, even with all of these overstacked abilities, just permanently casting Bone Spear against a single target did not make me go infinite. Now there's a couple different things here that you need to take note of, right? Hued Flesh is another lucky hit ability which generates corpses whenever you hit a target, and it's going to generate corpses at double the efficiency when you're attacking a boss. So against an elite monster or a base monster, anything that isn't a boss really, you can't rely on the Ring of Sacrilegious always having corpses to be able to trigger in between every single attack. Whereas if I were to swap over to a boss monster, while we may not see like a ridiculously better performance by our gear here, you should expect on average to be able to generate even more essence every second when using Sacrilegious Ring in this manner and continuing to stack on overlapping abilities with vulnerable on them. And luckily we're actually doing pretty good, so I think that this highlights this pretty well. But then you get to rely on systems like Lidless Wall, also producing a Bone Storm when you hit another target. So using Bone Storm here and then continuing to attack will apply another effect on top of the boss monster or whatever monster you're currently fighting to give you even more opportunities to be able to trigger lucky hit and the vulnerable procs be able to continue to generate more essence. But there's one little thing here that I haven't quite touched on, and it's actually why Deathless Visage is such an amazingly powerful tool for this build, but the Bone Spears leaving behind echoes that then explode also can trigger lucky hit exposed flesh, since this is triggered off of a monster just being hit and does not necessarily need to be triggered off of a skill with a lucky hit coefficient. So then on top of your Bone Spear being able to hit the target once with 3 shards and then the explosions being able to hit them again once per cast, we now have 5 total instances that can all trigger this system as well. But I talked about Paranormal Bone Spear roughly 48,000 minutes ago, and the reason why this was so important for the build was further increasing how many instances are hitting the target simultaneously for even more opportunities to be able to trigger exposed flesh in the exact same way. But this needs us to be able to apply vulnerable with 100% uptime. So while I personally could be using Bone Prison to be able to generate Vulnerable, which will last for 6 seconds, and then on top of that, casting Corpse Tendrils to be able to apply Vulnerable again, and that only lasts for 3 seconds, you'll notice that we have downtime where we don't have vulnerability. In literally the moment you don't lose Vulnerable, every single instance that's hitting the target can't proc Exposed Flesh anymore. You can still proc Lidless Wall along with your gloves, but you can no longer proc this instance. So even minuscule amounts of downtime and vulnerability are going to cause your engine to stall out immediately and feel terrible. Currently in Season 3 though, we have our Seneschal Companion, which, with the ability of applying Breaking, can maintain permanent uptime on vulnerability. I do not currently have 100% rank 10 stone, but at rank 10 it does have 100% uptime. So now we can rely on this tool for being able to apply vulnerability, and if you still feel a little bit iffy or if you don't have your stone at tier 10 as well, you can be using systems like the Bone Prison for being able to maintain permanent uptime, allowing us to use the significantly stronger version of Bone Spear that spits out 2 more shards to increase our damage, increase our crit chance, and increase our ability to proc these systems. You notice that here, against a boss training dummy with Sacrilegious eating up the entire time, our Seneschal Companion generating essence every single time that it attacks, and then also producing a vulnerability for us, we haven't had to do anything else, and I've been able to talk through the entirety of this explanation without running out of essence, with no uber uniques currently on my character. What this ultimately was an incredibly long-winded essay was hoping to explain the way that the overlapping systems in the game need to work together and actually be built upon in intelligent ways for you to be able to get the same outcomes that you might be seeing your favorite content creators, build guide writers, or just high-level players who are competing right now are able to get out of their builds. Typically, it comes down to a lack of overlapping systems with vulnerability here as our example, a lack of stats on your gear with maximum essence along with resource generation and essence cost reduction as great examples here. But if you put together this Megazord of lucky hit resource with exposed flesh lucky hit resource with essence cost reduction and essence generation and vulnerability on hit in your Seneschal generating essence, and then being able to trigger as many damage instances as possible in any given combat scenario, you can manage to go infinite off of your essence on your character. And you'll see, again, even with the gear that I have, which like at this point isn't perfect gear, but it's pretty damn good gear, especially the rings that I have on, and especially with the stats that actually matter, they're near all max cap, I'm still not going infinite against these targets because sometimes it just doesn't work. And what it ultimately means is that your build is going to require the additions of the Bone Prison use, Bone Spirit with Shattered Spirit, straight up just using a generator, relying on corpse consumption from Grim Harvest and Sacrilegious, the overlapping of your Lidless Wall with Bone Storm. What you specifically need for your stats is going to be based off of how many of these systems you have working at maximum efficiency. What I generally hope your takeaway here is a better understanding of how all this works, but most importantly, sometimes you just need to use a generator. Sometimes you just need to add essence back onto your character. Sometimes you do just need to use a sub-efficient or a suboptimal tool like Bone Prison and just accept the fact that it's going to very slightly interrupt how often you're able to cast Bone Spear so that you can continue to output damage at its maximum potential or whatever build you're currently playing on. I find a lot of the times people playing Blood Surge just like absolutely refuse to use Hemorrhage, even though Hemorrhage is by far the best tool that the Necromancer has for just easily and efficiently generating essence at max speed. So I hope that this ridiculous essay that I assume only like 5 people end up watching helped to explain how all of these things work together and ultimately make your journey in this season and all future seasons of Diablo 4 a little bit easier to wrap your head around the puzzle that is managing your essence on any build. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.